So let's talk about the white supremacy culture readings. I know, Becky, you've looked at this before, but there is plenty there. So one of the suggestions was to journal about a characteristic that you identify with, that you sort of see turning up, especially in yourself. And even if you didn't journal about that, I wanted to ask each of you, what is one of those characteristics that's mentioned in the article that really resonates for you?
I can share. I don't know that I can come up with a specific instance that fits, and maybe you can tell me if it does. But I will say that I'm familiar with this document. I had seen it several times, and I was just at a meeting 2 weeks ago, which was a handout. So I've read it, and I read it again. But then I listened to the July 2018 call, and listening to Amanda and the people on the call talk about it, and I had written down the things that are problems for me: perfectionism, fear of open conflict, objectivity. I think those are the three big ones for me. I have really started to let go of the perfectionism thing quite a while back, because I learned it doesn't work in the activist volunteer culture as it does in the workplace. Perfectionism was almost a mode of survival for me in the workplace. But it's just the opposite, really, when you're doing volunteer work and working with activists. And so I've been letting go of that for the last 5 years. But I still have that in me, of course. Fear of open conflict is definitely true, and objectivity, logical thinking, linear thinking. Another survival technique in the workplace for me. But listening to the discussions, real people talking about these things, and Amanda guiding those discussions, was just amazing. It just brought all those things so much more to life for me, so that the familiar feelings came up, and I just delved more deeply into these characteristics, and understood a little more deeply how they are in me. So there was one situation which I had talked to Amanda about on a one-on-one call, and I don't know where this fits, but it's definitely white supremacy culture. I had watched at one of our surge meetings a film, and in this film, it was about what happened after the Civil War and the new Jim Crow. And there was a white woman I think it was her grandfather, had been an supposedly upstanding member of the community. This was down south, and they were very wealthy, and he had been a slave owner. And what he got involved in was, and I can't think of the name of the term yet right now, but it's sort of like that chattel thing where you have sharecroppers working on your land, and you create a system so that they're always in debt. They always owe you money, so they're still slaves. So it was that, and I can't remember the term for that at the moment. So she was making this confession about how terrible she learned her grandfather was back then, and she had always been taught, that he was a wonderful, upstanding citizen in the community. And when the film was over and we had comments, without even realizing it until after I had said it, I said, "Oh my gosh, I can't imagine feeling like that woman." And I, identified who I was talking about. Can you imagine feeling that way and realizing that your ancestor was terrible like that, or did such terrible things? And it was a few minutes after I said it that I thought, what have I just done? I've just identified with the white woman, in all the pain that was portrayed in that movie, I identified with the pain of the white woman. That's that's the thing I brought out. And I mean, that, if that isn't white supremacy culture, I don't know what is. But it was quite a lesson to me. And it was just so, I felt it so strongly that, at the end of the meeting when I was with my colleagues, we were cleaning it up. I had to speak out about it, and I talked about it with them. I said, "What was that about?" I just want to slap myself off the side of the head. What part of white supremacy culture in the categories that are in the Oakland document would you classify that? I don't know.
I mean, in a way, that's like white fragility, identifying with the pain and the discomfort of being confronted with racism rather than the impact of it on people of color.
Yeah. And it's not that I don't feel that impact too.
Sure.
That was the thing that I mentioned in the meeting. Yeah, that was apparently the strongest for me at that point. So.
But how great that you spoke up afterwards and shared vulnerably some of this further processing that you did, and some of the awareness and how you are learning. I mean, so one of the things that this talks about is that an antidote to a culture of perfectionism is to have a culture of learning where people can make mistakes and you recognize that risk-taking and mistakes are ultimately better, because when there's an anxious culture where no one can screw up, no one risks anything, no one can be vulnerable, and it's not real, it's not creative or innovative, and people don't bring their whole selves there, So, in a way, you were sort of modeling that, that telling on yourself, I think, is really, really great. But it's humbling when it shows up in us, right?
Yeah.
Was there anything else in particular that you saw in the recording that was really an aha for you?
I just think, unfortunately, I can't always remember things a couple of hours afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of things. That recording was really great. I listened to it this afternoon and early this afternoon, and it just really was helpful to me. Yeah, and one of the questions I think that Amanda brought up was, how am I paralleling the system?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's something I ought to be asking myself now and then. Yeah, because as she said, the pull is so strong that we're swimming in this culture, So yeah, and learning how to play, and what struck me was just how I was in the workplace and the things I did in the workplace in order to survive. In order to survive, in order to do well at my job, and in order to advance, and all of those things that I bought into. And I worked for a company that trained the trainers of community health agencies who served what we called underserved populations. So, I was not working for an oil company or something like that. Yeah. But yet, we had a white culture system in our organization, despite the diverse group of employees we had. It was definitely a white culture system, and I didn't recognize it at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, in fact, that this set of characteristics was drawn from working with nonprofits. So even though it looks like corporate culture, you know, in some ways, nonprofits are like corporate culture wannabes. They have, you know, this is how you emulate that which is prestigious, that which gets respect in the world, that which is professional, and often professional is code for white culture, right? You know, so we have a tendency to not recognize culture unless it's not white culture. And I think part of what this does is name that there is white culture, that is an actual thing. And sometimes we're operating in it unawares and unconsciously.
I think that the one that perfectionism was the one that really came up for me. I feel like it's the biggest one, and mostly around the inner critic and my ability, my desire not to make a mistake or put my foot in it. I mean, I feel like it's surfacing a lot around the racial justice from the heart curriculum, because I'm realizing how much my own sense of perfectionism actually has gotten in the way for years of me actually speaking up and speaking my truth and standing up as an ally, and because I'm just afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. So that's been a big thing over the last couple of months since doing this curriculum that I've been paying a lot of attention to. I mean, I think so I think similar to what Carol said, I've been working on this for a long time, but the perfectionism thing. So the grip that perfectionism had on me has mellowed out even over the last several years. But I realized that holding very tight around my ability to have and be in conversation about racial equity with others, was really there without me understanding that it was there. It's white supremacy culture. It's also very male oriented, paternalistic, patriarchal culture. So many of these things I have been exposed to, many of these things I was exposed to through my work as a feminist and have been paying attention to for a really long time. So either or thinking, feel like, yes, I still get, I don't feel like I get wrapped into that often anymore. But fear of open conflict for sure is something also that I have grappled with on a personal level. I feel like it's interesting to look at there's the culture that we're steeped in, and then there's also personality preferences and patterns of behavior that come from the family unit or the way we were brought up and what we were taught to value or not value, some of which comes from the culture and some of which I think also comes from very individual experiences.
Sure.
And then the other thing I would say is that I'm the only one. I loved looking at that. I feel like that one, the belief that's still very present, that if something's going to get done, I have to do it or it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been actually working really hard on my ability to delegate, really hard. So that's good.
And part of that is developing the ability to notice and nurture other people's gifts.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally.
So one of the things I love about this is that the descriptions of the antidotes are like, oh, well, yeah, of course that's the way it should be, in
Right.
my mind at least, right? Like
Right.
that's the workplace I want to be in,
Right.
one where there is a culture of learning and people are affirmed and listened to. And so it makes me realize that there's a part of me that kind of reacts like, oh, perfectionism, but that means that you want to sacrifice good work, right? I mean, there's a part of me that sort of is protective of all of those values because it feels to me like you're watering things down or you're lowering standards. And I think some of the antidotes make clear that that's not the case, right? That you can get better work when you're not squishing people. And I watched a documentary recently about women in film, especially as directors and writers. And there was a director that the director of FX was sort of confronted because when they did an analysis, his network had the most white males in protagonistic roles in as characters and as writers and directors. And he was actually kind of really humbled and heard that critique and started to proactively, contact his production teams and say, we want to change this. We want women characters. We want people of color. And we will support you with resources to do this. And they did. I mean, they went from like 70 something percent white male to 47% or something. I mean, it was a huge, and this was in 2 or 3 years. So dramatic. And what he said was, I thought we'd have to sacrifice quality. Like I thought we'd have to sort of take second tier people. And he said, and what we found was the opposite, because they'd had their hand on the scale for white men. And they now were opening up to more talent and more voices that were more interesting and more varied. And I think that was such a good lesson for the kind of white fear of, sort of having the familiar way and you're afraid to kind of let go of that this is an alternative vision of not just what we're against, but what we want to be for in fostering a culture of liberation and a culture of inclusion that we could make better work. We could be more effective. It might be more uncomfortable a lot of the time, but it would welcome more of our whole selves. And that would be, it would give us a better output, welcoming people's talents and their ideas and having people from one end of the spectrum debating with people on the other end and pointing out their blind spots, So I think that idea of like thinking that you're sacrificing something is really important to challenge.
I completely agree. I think that is, and that definitely does surface. I think about it, the like I have to do this myself versus delegating, and just my own, like learning how to develop the muscle of delegating and letting go a little bit, and how that's freed up so much of my time once I got and then it's just practice, right? You just practice it. All of these things are practices. You integrate them, you practice them, you reflect on them, you notice the feelings of fear that maybe surface or doubt, and then keep going. And but I think it just goes back to, like, I love the piece around discomfort, like that. The antidote is understanding that discomfort is a part of learning. It's a natural part of learning, that you need to have it if you're going to learn, because you can't learn things without actually experiencing some level of discomfort if you're going to change things that you knew. Or, I mean, I think all behavior change has some level of discomfort engaged in it.
Listening to you talk, both Carol and Amanda and Erika, I realize how much I have in me sort of only one right way. And also that I can do it. I have to do it by myself for it to get done. And I see that actually is connected to power hoarding, that it's like, well, I'm not going to trust anybody else to do it, so I'm going to be the one in control. And I think one of the things for me lately that's I've been involved with a group in a regional Quaker activity where a group of us have been working on some presentations and a program of noticing patterns. And I've been so delighted, because if it was up to me, we wouldn't be doing it, because I'm not far enough along on the journey to be the leader of it. And so I'm just really appreciating that that the skills that I do have can be added to it, and coming to this great sense of community and satisfaction from actually being part of a team and not being the one in charge. I think I definitely can. I'm a very big doer, and so if somebody else isn't going to do it, I'll step up into it. And it may actually be why there's a part of why nobody wants to take on being president of the board, because I did so many things. And people see me doing that, and they think, oh, I'm going to have to do that. It's like,
Yeah.
you don't have to. You'd just be better at delegating.
Well, and in systems, when somebody overfunctions, the other people underfunction.
Yeah.
There's reward in both of those roles. The overfunctioner stays in control. The underfunctioners don't have to do as much and don't have to take responsibility for when things go wrong. And it sometimes takes somebody who's been doing a lot to step back and say, I'm waiting, folks, for other people to really find their agency.
There's a real link between, I think, I think it's pretty obvious, between perfectionism and I am the only one. I am the only one is also one of my characteristics. And one of the things I've learned in being conscious of that and trying not to be the only one is that when it isn't done the way that I would have done it, so there's my feeling of perfectionism, I have to learn to let go of that. And that's that puts me in a really good learning place, a place of discomfort, yes, as you pointed out, Amanda. But it's like, okay, well, he or she, that's not how I would have done it, but so what? Let it go. Let it go. So, I see that letting go of I'm the only one is also helping me let go of perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, very connected.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's true for me too. And also what Becky was saying, right? Like the power hoarding, like they all kind of intersect with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And people can let go in a sort of passive aggressive way sometimes. Like, well, if you're not going to let me do it, fine, then I just won't do anything. That's not what we mean.
Right.
But it can be hard when you're sort of trying to learn to let go of how you've done things, or, being able to make all of the decisions to stay engaged and let someone else, have agency. But, when I'm thinking about how some of these things really abet, some of these things abet domination in that they isolate us from each other.
Mm.
They divide people so that they each feel like they can't be vulnerable, they can't call upon other people for help, they can't make mistakes. That kind of culture and that internalized sort of sense of how it's okay to be makes people a lot easier to control.